Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Fire Breathing Rob. Please like, subscribe, and also follow us on YouTube. We greatly appreciate that. And if you're listening to us on one of the 10 radio stations we appear on, thanks so much for that. I have somebody on today that I've heard on Jimmy Dore, also heard him on Jordan Sheridan's Status Quo a couple days back. This is Professor Richard Wolff, and he is an American economist. And if you want to learn more about him, go to www.rdwoff.com. He also has a YouTube channel, and I will definitely tease that at the end of the interview. So, Professor Wolff, thanks so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it.
Glad to be here. This is the kind of conversation I look forward to having.
First of all, Professor Wolff, can you talk about the crisis and the response by the federal government? It just seems like, from a progressive point of view, the progressives that we put into office to fight for us, to fight for workers, they're not really doing anything. We've seen Bernie Sanders, AOC, the squad, they're voting for these bills, and it's all these bills that are, they're giving money to the corporations and not any money is going to workers.
Yeah, well, let me try to address that. We have known about viruses because they're part of nature. They've been around as long as human beings have been around, and occasionally they're very dangerous. But that happens to other species that are not human beings. Viruses have attacked all kinds of animals and plants, and we've known it for a long time. Just to give you a couple of examples, back in 1918, we had a terrible virus that killed hundreds of thousands of American citizens at that time. It was called the Spanish flu, but it actually started in a military base in Kansas here in the United States. And so we've known for at least that century how dreadful these viruses can be. And in more recent history, a few years ago, we had SARS and MERS and Ebola. We know very well what the viruses can do. We know that the number one thing that has to happen when a virus hits is you got to separate those who have the disease from everybody else to prevent the spreading from the one to the other. We know all of it. So the only interesting question is, why was that not done in a timely way, basically starting at the beginning of this year? We knew about the virus in November and December because it hit in China and then in other parts of Asia. We didn't do anything. Well, let's explain. First, why did the private sector not do it? Why weren't there warehouses full of testing equipment and gloves and masks and ventilators and hospital beds and all the stuff you need? And the answer is, it's not profitable for private companies to do that. What company is going to make a lot of test kits or masks and then stick them in a warehouse somewhere, maybe have them sit there for a year or 2 or 5 for maybe when something bad happens? So private companies didn't do it because it's not profitable. And private companies know that you get rewarded if what you do is profitable, and you get punished in the economy if what you do isn't. Yeah. So they didn't. All right, they didn't. We understand that. Private capitalist enterprise, and this has to be admitted, isn't a good way of being safe in the face of disease. It just isn't. And that has to be faced, and there's no cutesy way around that. All right, then the government could have and should have come in and said, all right, private capitalists won't do this because that's not the way the capitalist system works. But we're the government, we'll do it. We'll come in and we'll buy the tests, the gloves, the masks, the whole bit. We'll pay a price that gives these companies a profit because they won't do it otherwise. And then we'll store them in stockpiles around the country so that they're there when a bad virus comes. We know it's going to happen, we just don't know when. But this government doesn't do that. It doesn't do it because Mr. Trump doesn't think like that. It doesn't do it because the Republican Party wants us to believe that whatever private capitalist companies do must be the best thing. And the last thing they want to do is get into the public eye and say, gee, private capitalism really no good at this, so we're going to come in and compensate for that. Even our Democrats, like you rightly say, Rob, they're not doing it either. They're not even called for it. They're not. So the end result is, between the private capitalists not doing it and the government not coming in to compensate, we weren't ready. And let me say just two things about it. We are now suffering the price. We are paying the price as a nation for the failure of private enterprises to produce what we need for public health, and the failure of the government to come in and fix it when the private sector failed to do it. And in case people are wondering, I'm an economist, what was efficient here? Let me make it real blunt. We have already lost 50 times more wealth than it would have cost us to produce the masks, to stockpile them around the country, likewise the ventilators, likewise the gloves and the test. This is not efficient. This is an example of capitalist inefficiency, worse than any I could have imagined in the classroom, because it's killing our people and it is destroying our economy.
So what would have been your plan for this?
It would have been completely different. And I'm going to give you only a couple of examples that I draw from American history, because I don't want people to hear what I'm saying thinking, oh, he's making that up, or it comes from the moon, or we could never see it. So I'm going to give you two examples from American history. The first thing I would do is the following, because I think it's the most urgent. We now have at least 30 million Americans out of work. The only other time in American history we've had that is the Great Depression of the 1930s. Here's what we did in the Great Depression that if I were president, would do now. I would re-employ every single one of those 30 million people. It is a crazy irrationality to say to people who have skills, have energy, are healthy, are adults, who want to work, that this system won't give them a job. Lord knows we have lots of work to do. These are the people who could do it. And if the private companies lay them off, okay, then the government is to play the role of employer of last resort. And let me give you very quickly what they could do. Number one, we have tested less than 2% of the American people to see if they even have this virus. That is a catastrophe. We don't know who's sick, and therefore who's at risk of making his or her boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, children sick as well. We need to test. That's an enormous job. Hire the unemployed, train them, and it's not hard to do, get them out there testing everybody, number one. Number two, we know that there's a serious climate crisis in this country. We have huge areas of the country that could and should be planted with trees, done all kinds of things done to improve the environment. Let's do it. We know that we have millions of teachers out of work. They can't teach. Millions of students not in school. We know how to set up a tutoring program. Every teacher has a different person for every other hour of the day, of 6 a day or 4 a day or whatever it is. And we should have established a tutoring program allowing one-on-one teacher to student, everybody who's unemployed who has any skill. For example, yours, how to do radio, how to learn, teach it. Come on, have the government set you up, have people sign up, and you become, for an hour, intimate, personal tutoring. It's a wonderful way to make the unemployment stop and to do something useful in our society. I mean, we could have you starting to teach people how to do social distancing. We have to reorganize our workplaces so we can be easily adjusted to 6 or 7 feet apart so we don't pass on a disease. The work to be done is obvious. The people need the jobs. Paying people to sit and do nothing is a 1,000 times worse than paying them to do something to give back to the society, which they want to do. Why am I telling you this? Because in 1934, under Franklin Roosevelt, a Democratic president, we had a federal jobs program for the unemployed. Between 1934 and 1941, roughly 15 million American workers got a job. That meant they felt good about themselves. They didn't go through the painful personal experience of feeling unwanted, of feeling unproductive, of feeling kind of an outcast. They didn't have that. And they were able to earn an income. So they didn't lose their home because they could cover the mortgage and they could pay the rent and all of the valuable things. I don't know if you know it, but half the national parks in the western part of the United States that people have been visiting to this day were produced and built by people hired by the government because they were unemployed. Why don't we do that again? That would be the first thing I would do. And here's the second. And I'm likewise taking an example from American history. Over the last 4 weeks, Jeffrey Bezos, the richest man in America, the CEO of the Amazon Corporation, his personal wealth went up by 24 billion with a B dollars because of the value of Amazon shares, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, while 30 million Americans are unemployed, while we have the worst crisis in our country's history in a century, we allow a man who was already the richest person in the country to become richer. It is so obscene, it's hard for me to say it. Okay, what could we do? We ought to pass what used to be called an excess profits tax. You know why it used to be called that? Because we've done that in the United States. We did it in World War I, and we did it again in World War II, and we did it again in the Korean War. In each of those, the president at that time said, it is not possible in America for some people to be suffering because we're in a war, for some people to be dying because we're in a war, and have other people not suffer, not die, and rake in money off of the war emergency. Okay, if I were president, I'd say we are now in the coronavirus emergency. I would say it's like a war. We oughtn't to allow anyone to profit off of this disaster. And so the government is going to step in. Any profit or wealth you accumulate during the pandemic, the government is going to come, tax it away from you, and use it to do the things that need to be done for the unemployed, the poor, the little businesses that are going out of business. Come on, this is a no-brainer. What kind of a society do we live in where not only are none of these things done, even though they were done before in American history, but we don't even talk about it as a nation. That is, in the end, the worst thing.
Professor Wolff, do you think that we're already in depression territory right now while we're heading there?
Yes, there's no, in my mind, there's no question at all. We have never seen what we saw for the month of April, basically, that the first quarter of this year, the total output of goods and services, that's the GDP it's called, gross domestic product, fell by almost 5%. That's unheard of, that kind of a drop. And that was for the first quarter. The real pandemic didn't hit until the last couple of weeks of March. That's the last couple of weeks of that quarter. So what you're really waiting for is the catastrophic drop that we're going to see in the second quarter, which includes the months of April, May that we're in now, and June. So get ready. If you think it was bad what we just heard, it is going to be worse. Yes. Short answer to your question is we are already in what is already the second worst collapse of American capitalism, on our way to challenging the record which was held in the 1930s. One last point. We were supposed to have learned in the catastrophe of the Great Depression the lessons of how to do what to prevent this from happening again. Every president since Roosevelt has been president during a time when the economy went down, and every president made this promise. I promise that I will get you out of this depression if you follow this monetary policy and fiscal policy. And then he went on, this president, every one of them, and said, we have to do this not only to get out of the current crisis, but to make sure we never make Americans go through it again. Every president made the promise. No president has ever delivered on that promise, and that included Mr. Trump, who's been telling us since he got in 2016 that we have the greatest economy, we have the greatest economy. We don't. We have an economy that failed to prepare and that is now among the worst shapes of any economy in the world.
Professor Wolff, I want to talk about this since you just brought up monetary theory. Can you discuss modern monetary theory?
I think the notion that we couldn't afford it was always a fake. That argument was put forward by people because they were afraid of something. They were afraid that if you spend money to help average people, help them with their college education, or help them with their rent, or help them with their little business, that in the end, this would cost taxes that would be levied on rich people or big corporations. That's what they were afraid of. They didn't mind the government spending on them. That's why they didn't bring up the problem when the government spent on them. I'll give you an example. The biggest outlay of money by the Trump administration, the biggest, was not the Defense Department, and it was not any domestic program. It was the tax cut of December 2017. In that act, the government went to the richest people in America and to the biggest corporations and gave them billions of dollars by cutting their taxes from 35 to 21%. That's roughly a 40% cut in your tax bill. That was an enormous, and no one said in the Republican Party or in the government or in the big businesses, hey, we've just had 30 years of the best record for business in American history, which they did. We don't need this. If we've ever needed it, we need it less now. Why are you giving us this now? You didn't hear that. That's the truth, by the way, but you didn't hear it. So suddenly, they didn't care that this was going to cost a ton of money. Where are you going to, if you don't collect all those billions from corporations and the rich, then the government has only three options. Number one, it raises that tax from the other people. In other words, you cut business taxes, you cut rich people's taxes, you could make it up by taxing the middle and the bottom. But if the government tried that, you'd have a revolution here, so that's not really available. Number two, you could cut government programs or government services because you're not getting the money in, you don't spend it. But you can't really do that because people would make a revolution then too. What are you going to do? Tell all college students your loan is now going to cost you 6% a year, or we're not going to give you a loan, or we're not going to fix the roads, or we're not going to, you can't do that. You've been doing that enough. You now have a revolution on your hands. So there's only one option left. If you can't cut spending and you can't tax the mass of people, how are you going to cope with much less revenue coming in since you just cut the taxes on corporations and the rich? And the answer is you borrow. The government goes in and borrows. And here comes the irony, and let me be a teacher for a minute, okay? Here's the irony. Who does the government borrow from when it borrows? And the answer is from the rich and the big corporations. What is it borrowing from them? Where do they get the money? Because you cut their taxes. They didn't have to spend that money on taxes. So instead of giving the government the money in taxes, they lend that money to the government, which means the government has to pay it back. And while the corporations and the rich are waiting, they get paid interest. This is the biggest swindle of public finance you could imagine. And the only other people that the government can borrow from, besides the same corporations and the same rich people whose taxes they lowered, the only other place is foreign countries. And the United States government does that. And in case your listeners are not aware, let me explain. The United States government is the world's biggest debtor country. The United States owes more to the rest of the world than any other country on this planet. But here comes the news most don't understand. The biggest creditor country, that country in the world which has lent most to the United States government, is the People's Republic of China. Now, that money isn't lent to the United States for nothing. We have to pay interest. So every year, the United States sends to the people of China, the People's Republic of China government, tens of billions of dollars in interest payments. I just want everyone to understand, you and I and everybody listening pays taxes to Uncle Sam, which he collects and sends to China, which they can use any way they want. For example, building up their military. That's the way the world works. The rest is fakery. There's a lot of BS. That's the reality. So here's the crazy thing. Modern monetary theory pointed out, looking at this, that basically what the government can do is when it needs it, it just prints money. That's what happened. Let me explain how it works. When the government borrows money, the way I just described it to you, like when we cut the taxes in December 2017, now the government doesn't have any money, but it has to pay for the programs. It dare not cut them because it's politically impossible. So it has to borrow. Okay, it now borrows. How does it do that? It issues little certificates. They're called treasury securities. They are IOUs. If you lend money to the government, you get this treasury security, which says printed on it, the government owes you $6 million, which will be paid on the 18th of September, 2031, or whatever. That's how it's done. Okay. A bank will lend to the government, or an insurance company will lend to the government, or a big corporation will lend to, or a rich person. Mostly you and I will not know about this because the government never borrows from little folks like us, except for those savings bonds we give to our kids for their confirmation or something like that. But you know what I'm saying. So here's how it works. The Federal Reserve goes to the banks, goes to the insurance companies, and goes to the rich corporations and says, you have treasury securities that you got when you lent to the government. We're the Federal Reserve. We will buy them from you for cash. So the way it works is, suppose you lent the government $1 million and you have a certificate. How does the Federal Reserve get you to sell that to the Federal Reserve? They offer you $1,050,000. You bought it yesterday. You can sell it today. You've made 50 grand on your transaction. Of course you'll do it. Where does the Federal Reserve get the money to buy that? It makes it up. It prints it. The Federal Reserve, and this is what's so hard for Americans. The job of the Federal Reserve is to manage the money. They have the legal right to produce money. If you do it, you will be arrested and go to jail. If I do it, I will be arrested and go to jail. The Federal Reserve is the sole legal authority, literally, to print money. The only other institution in society that is allowed, with constraints, but is allowed to do something similar, is your local commercial bank. They can also, for example, you go in there and say, I'd like to borrow $100,000 to open a little business. The bank says, okay. It puts down a new account, has your name, and hits a key, and that account has $100,000 in it. You can start writing checks. Where does that money come from? The bank created it, just like the Federal Reserve creates it. Between the Federal Reserve and banks, that's who creates the money supply in the United States. And modern monetary theory says, okay, that's the way it's been. We would prefer it to be done in a different way. It shouldn't be only done when someone has a debt. It should be done when the government needs to do something. So, for example, if we need to give good jobs to 30 million unemployed people, create the account, start paying them, and let the economy respond to where the money is. We don't have to worry, as we once thought we had to, that money has to have gold behind it or has to have some kinds of value or wealth. Money is just what it looks like, a green piece of paper, and we just have to manage it properly so that it gets us full employment, gets us a good functioning economy. Don't worry about the rest of them. It's kind of a leftover of a primitive way of thinking. We've been out of that a long time, and our brains have to kind of catch up.
First of all, what are your predictions? I mean, we see the craziness in Congress and in the White House. So what are your predictions for the crisis as it goes on with the inept intelligence in the White House, this inept leadership crisis that we have in this country? Joe Biden's not the answer to this. He has no policy on this. And, you know, how can you give people like me hope for this country? And I know truth hurts, but I appreciate the truth. But people that are my age and even people that are younger than 20 some odd years old, you know, kids just growing up, you know, what is the hope for them when, you know, this could be our new normal? We have a lack of leadership in this country, and no one's doing anything, as you stated throughout the whole interview. So what hope would you give us? And what kind of predictions are you making for this crisis, how long it's going to go on?
There is no way to predict how long this crisis. Let me answer the last part. I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could give you, but I don't know. And my advice to you is, if you encounter people who know what's going to happen, don't talk to them anymore, because they've given you every reason to go find somebody else to have the conversation with. But as to hope, there I feel a little bit differently. I couldn't agree with you more. This government has completely shown its incapacity to, I mean, nothing is more fundamental than keeping your population healthy and alive. This government failed to do that, and this private profit-driven capitalism failed to do that. And that's not a minor matter. That's the most important. If you're sick or dead, then the rest of it doesn't really matter. So they failed. And I couldn't agree with you more that Joseph Biden is a disaster. This is as old. He's a senator from Delaware. Delaware is only slightly larger than Rhode Island, so don't take it personally. But it's different from Rhode Island. Rhode Island has a long progressive history. Delaware does not. Delaware is the home where most corporations incorporate themselves. Mr. Biden has been a loyal spokesman for corporate America from the beginning to this minute. He's never been other than that. To expect him to come up with a solution under these circumstances means that you're just not paying attention. He is the same old establishment. You will get nothing from him, because that's what he is. Nothing. Political nothing, right? Sure, he doesn't have a plan. None of them do. He just wants the power. He wants, together with Schumer and Pelosi and the others, they want to be in rather than out, just like the Republicans would prefer to be in than to be out. None of them, they're all winging it. They're all panicking. They worry about the next election 90% of the time, and the other 10% of the time, who knows what they do. So does that mean there's no hope? No. I think we're already showing the way forward, because we're able to say, without hesitating, without worrying, that neither the established Republican nor the established Democrats are a solution. These are the two parties that think that the thing we need to do is get back to normal, get back on that train, speeding into the stone wall. That's what they'll do. They'll get us back to where we were, but that's not a place any of us ought to be wanting to go to, because that's what got us into this mess in the first place. So we're learning we got to find something else. And we're beginning to see. We're beginning to see it in Bernie. We began to see it in Ocasio-Cortez. There are more people like them coming up, particularly younger people. That's our future. And it's no minor matter to have learned the lesson. We have to break with what existed. Your generation, young people, have to understand more than normal. The old people, they're done. Their system, the way they did it, they're not done as persons. They're your mother and father and your grandpa and all that, and they deserve your respect as human beings. But in terms of the economic system, they left you no good. In terms of the political system, they left you no good. You've got to carve out a new way, and I think you will if you understand that that's your job. And don't let yourself be sucked into the conventional politics, because that's a dead end. Those are the people, they're going out. You know, there's a joke going around New York City that the thing that's going to lose the election for Mr. Trump is the fact that the older a person is, the more likely in this country he or she is to be a Trump supporter. So the passage of time is wiping out his vote, because in a sense, and there's a grain of truth in that. It's the old systems that are done. They don't know it. They don't want to face it any more than the people that are still building restaurants want to face it. But it's over. And I think that if young people can get that in their head, then they'll realize that people my age, we're hoping you do that. You help make the change. We tried. It wasn't time yet. Now, this is a system that's already on the ropes. That's what this pandemic shows. This system couldn't manage it. And no matter what anybody says, the majority of Americans see it every day, feel it. Whether your cousin comes down with the virus, or you just lost your job, or your mother did, or your cousin did, everyone is being touched by the failure of this system to give you the kind of life you had every reason to expect.
Professor Richard Wolff, it was truly an honor. Like I said, I'm a huge admirer of you, and I'm sure the listeners really enjoyed this, and I enjoyed the education. I would love to sit and hear you talk for 2 hours, but we're not going to do it today. But it was an honor, and truly, I really enjoyed this, and I hope we can do this again
Absolutely.
sometime soon. Thank you so much.
I enjoy it too, and I really value it. I really think that the American people and our moment in history, we need these conversations more than ever. So if you want to do it again in the future, get in touch. I'll be glad to.
I will, and I appreciate that. And thanks so much. All right, guys, thanks so much. And I hope you visit his website. And it's also, he does a lot of work for Democracy for Work, and you can check that out. And also his website is www.rdwolff.com. Professor Wolff, again, thanks so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it.
Okay,
and stay
Rob,
safe.
take care.
All
Bye-bye.
right.